Hi, my name's Avis. For 6 years, I carried the same small act of kindness in my hands, a meal for a man who sat quietly on the same worn bench outside the bus station. I never asked his name. I never waited for a thank you. I didn't need either. It was enough just to know that for a moment he wasn't invisible. But when my wedding came, my sister made sure that man never crossed the doorway. She leaned in with that sharp little smirk and hissed, "This isn't a charity event." To her, he was nothing more than a stain on the carpet she didn't want near her big moment. She had no idea who he really was. Neither did I. Until the door swung open and 20 Marines walked into my wedding reception, their boots striking the floor like thunder. They lined up in perfect formation and saluted me. All eyes turned toward me, then my mother's fork froze in midair, my sister's smile cracking into confusion. The room fell silent. You'd think that would have changed something. You'd think their respect might have forced my family to finally see me. But if anything, it only made things worse. Because the truth is, my family had always decided where I belonged. At dinners, I was the one shoved down the table, wedged between the coat rack and the bathroom door. No matter how early I arrived, no matter how much food I carried, that tiny forgotten space was always mine. Nobody ever said it aloud, but the message was clear. You don't belong at the center. You belong on the edges. It was Sunday dinner at my mother's house, the kind of ritual gathering that looked warm from the outside, but felt like walking barefoot across broken glass once you stepped inside. The roast was always overcooked, the wine bottom shelf, and the conversations sharper than any knife in the drawer. That night, I came carrying lemon rosemary potatoes in a Tupperware container, carefully made, carefully seasoned, carefully ignored. My sister, with her perfect teeth and perfect posture, didn't look up. She was mid-story, swirling her wine like she was hosting royalty. I slipped the dish onto the counter as quietly as possible, as though my very existence might spill something on the rug. No one said a word. Not even a half-hearted "smells good." My cousin Josh was knee-deep in refinancing details no one cared about, and my mother was nodding along like she understood every syllable. I took my place at the table. My place. Not chosen, but assigned by years of habit. I sat there close enough to hear everything, far enough to be forgotten, just as I always did. And right on cue, my sister's voice cut through the air. "Guess what Avis is still doing?" She sneered. She didn't even glance at me. Didn't need to. Still feeding that same homeless guy outside the bus station. Every single morning, rain or shine, like some kind of ritual. She laughed. Not loudly, just enough to let everyone know it was safe to join in. And they did. Not because it was funny, but because disagreeing would have been harder. 7 years, she pressed on. 7 years of playing saint with sandwiches. Honestly, it's like communion to her. My mother chuckled softly. That gentle, weary chuckle that said, "What can we do? That's just Avis." And no one looked at me. No one asked why. The joke rolled on past like wine around the table. My cousin Josh finally added, "Bet he's got a whole buffet going from women like her. You should check he's not reselling the food on the side." I smiled. I always do. My smile is my armor, my disguise. A small laugh here, a nod there, enough to keep the peace. On the outside, I played the part of the agreeable one, the quiet one. On the inside, I went still. That deep storm center stillness where the house is shaking, but you don't dare move a muscle. After dessert, I stayed behind to clean. I always stayed behind. My sister, of course, excused herself with a kiss on Mom's cheek and a chirped, "Love you, don't wait up." No one thanked me. No one noticed when I finally slipped out. The night air was cool sharp against my sweater as I walked to my car. The street was dark, almost too quiet, and I sat behind the wheel longer than necessary, just breathing, processing. Reminding myself that silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes silence is just the sound of being erased. Here's the thing about being the quiet one in a loud family: they write your role before you ever get a chance to speak. You're the soft one, the agreeable one, the one who doesn't take up space. You become the wallpaper, always present, never central. And the moment you try to step outside that role, the moment you dare to push back or demand to be seen, first, they look confused. Then they reject you. I drove home slowly that night, the kind of slow where you're not afraid of being late because there's nothing waiting for you but silence. The streetlights flickered across my windshield, catching pieces of me in the glass. My eyes tired but unyielding. My mouth pressed too tight like it was holding in all the words I never said. Kindness used to feel like enough. It used to feel like a shield, a way of saying to the world, I can still believe in good things, even if you don't. But lately, kindness felt heavier. Not a shield anymore, but a weight I carried alone while others pointed and laughed at the burden they never had to lift. When I was 9, I sat on the back porch with my father. He held a chipped mug of black coffee like it was armor steam rising between us in the cool morning air. His voice was steady low, the kind you wanted to lean into. The strongest people, he said, don't ask for applause. They help anyway. My father was a Marine, a field medic, the kind of man who would drag a bleeding soldier across the dirt before bothering to patch up his own wounds. When he died, the funeral overflowed with words like honor service, sacrifice. But words are easy. What most people never understood was what he meant when he talked about quiet strength. It wasn't about medals or speeches. It was about showing up when no one else would. It was about carrying the weight without complaint. I've tried to live that way. God, I've tried. But it's hard in a family where the loudest voice always wins, where volume is valued more than virtue. The next morning, I woke up before the sun like always. My body knew the routine better than my mind did. I didn't linger in bed. I didn't replay the dinner table laughter or the sting of my sister's words. Routine is the one thing I can control. And control is how I survive. I cracked an egg, folded it into a sandwich, and wrapped it carefully in foil. Slipped a napkin beside it, written in my usual 3 words. Hope today is kind. I poured hot coffee into my old to-go thermos. The lid was chipped, the handle cracked, but it still did its job. It still held warmth. Maybe in some way it was like me. By 6:45 a.m., I was on the familiar walk toward the bench. Same old wood, one side bowed from years of weather and weight sitting under the skeletal arms of a maple tree. The man was there as always. Same coat, same worn gloves, same silence that spoke louder than words ever could. I never expected gratitude. That was never the point. But he always gave me something, just a nod. Small, barely there, but enough to say, I see you. This morning, though, something was different. As I bent down to place the sandwich and thermos on the bench, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked neatly beneath the cup, folded carefully like it mattered. My hands froze. For a moment, I just stared at it. My heart caught between fear and curiosity. The paper wasn't rushed, wasn't angry. No messy scrawl. The letters were deliberate, shaky, but steady enough to feel intentional. I didn't open it there. Not yet. Instead, I looked at him. And he looked back. His eyes held stories I'd never asked for, scars I'd never seen, battles I couldn't imagine. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. He just nodded again, firmer this time. Like something had shifted between us, like we'd crossed into a new kind of understanding. Back at my car, I finally unfolded the note with trembling hands. 1 sentence. That was all. Tomorrow I'll come not for food, but to return what was given. I read it once. Then again. And again. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. Truly seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. My body lay still, but my mind paced restless circles. The note sat on my kitchen counter next to a mug of tea gone cold hours ago, staring at me like a question I wasn't ready to answer. I watched the clock tick past midnight. Watched the world grow quiet outside my window. And still the note remained. Waiting. By morning, my phone was buzzing nonstop notifications, stacking one after another, reminders about dress fittings, flower deliveries, final head counts. My wedding was a week away, but instead of feeling like a celebration, it felt like a stage production I hadn't auditioned for. Everyone else seemed to know their lines. I was just the extra holding a script that didn't fit in my hands. Later that afternoon, I drove to her house for what was supposed to be our final wedding planning meeting. I say our, but truthfully, it had never been ours. From the beginning, I had been a guest in my own celebration. My role was to nod, smile, and trust the process. That's what she called it, the process. As if my own taste, my own vision were a liability to be managed. As if I were some stray she was rescuing from myself. Kalin, our planner, met me at the door with her trademark too bright smile clipboard clutched like a shield. She always struck me as someone walking a tightrope, balancing the impossible task of keeping my sister pleased while simultaneously keeping me from disappearing completely. Inside, she was already seated at the dining table, her laptop open, fingers tapping, posture perfect. She didn't look up when I walked in. "We've got a few minor tweaks to go over," she said flatly. "Mostly visuals." Kaylin gestured for me to sit at the far end of the table. A neat row of printed photographs lay in front of me, framed, mounted, arranged by theme. They were glossy, curated, polished within an inch of their lives. Photos of her at a fundraising gala. Her with her dog at the beach, hair catching the sun just so. Her holding a champagne glass at someone else's wedding. Then tucked off to the side, my eyes caught on something different. A photo of me and 3 women from the shelter laughing together after a volunteer baking session. Flour on our shirts, flowers pinned in our hair. That picture was messy, imperfect, real. It was the only one that felt like it belonged to me. But as I looked at it, Kaylin hesitated. Her hand hovered a second too long before she reached across, slid the photo toward the discard pile, and set it face down. "That one doesn't really match the vibe," my sister said without lifting her eyes from the laptop. "It's kind of domestic, you know?" Domestic. The word hit me harder than I expected. Kaylin gave me a quick apologetic glance before her pen kept moving. I said nothing. I just sat still and watched as the only image that felt like my truth vanished into the pile, erased with a single careless motion. Erased like me. Finally, she looked up. Her eyes met mine for the first time that day. "No offense, sis. It just didn't match the aesthetic." No offense. As if dismissal could be softened by those 2 words. As if I couldn't see through the veneer. It wasn't about aesthetics. We both knew it. It was about control. About narrative. About whose story was allowed to be told. By the time I left her house, the air outside felt heavier. Thick with something unsaid. Even the birds seemed quieter, as though they'd decided not to intrude on the silence hanging over me. I drove home in wordless stillness, rolling the windows down just to let the wind remind me I was real, that I wasn't just a prop in her stage play. That night, when the house was still and the walls pressed too close, I opened the drawer where I kept old letters. Inside, beneath childhood cards and faded scribbles, was the speech I had written months ago, back when I still thought this wedding was mine. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't polished. No grand metaphors, no rehearsed tears. Just me, honest, unfiltered. Words I wrote to anchor myself when everything else felt like smoke. I read it under the dome light of my car, too tired to even walk inside. I had written, in a world obsessed with who was seen, I want to be remembered for who I saw. Simple, true, mine. And yet, apparently, that didn't match the aesthetic either. The next evening was rehearsal night at the venue. Everyone was there, her commanding every corner of the room like a director calling shots. Kaylin juggling clipboards and phone calls. Alton hovering, trying to keep the peace. I sat quietly following the run-through until something caught my attention. They breezed past the order of events, ceremony, vows, closing. My stomach knotted. My hand went up almost before I realized. "Where's the section for my speech?" I asked. The room went still. Kaylin froze. My sister answered before she could. I told her to cut it. "It's just, you'd probably get emotional. And it's your day, you don't need that kind of pressure." Pressure. That's what she called it. "It's better this way," she added, smoothing it over with a smile. "Let your moment be calm, not messy." Messy. The word was a knife. Because I knew what she meant. Messy was code for real. And real had no place in her script. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I didn't even nod. I just sat there, silence folding itself around me like a shroud, wondering how it was possible to feel erased from your own life. But I saw it clearly then. This had never been about flowers or menus or seating charts. It wasn't about gold leaf versus sugar pearls. It was about something sharper, something deliberate and erasure. Every decision was a quiet way of stripping pieces of me, sanding me down until nothing remained except the parts that shone neatly under chandeliers. A story carefully shaped where I was allowed to smile but never speak, appear but never exist. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even turn on the radio. I just sat with the silence, the road stretching endlessly ahead of me, headlights flickering across the glass like ghosts. Sometimes grief doesn't come as sobs. It comes as stillness, as the weight of knowing you've been written out of your own life. Back in the apartment, I lit a single candle, just one on the kitchen counter. The flame danced in the dim light like it was alive, defiant. I poured a plain glass of water and unfolded my speech again. The paper had softened at the edges from being handled too much. The ink slightly faded, but the words still pulsed with the same heartbeat they had the day I wrote them. I didn't change a word. I couldn't. It wasn't for the guests anymore. It wasn't for applause or approval. I was writing it, keeping it for the woman who still lived somewhere deep inside me. Quiet, overlooked, bruised, but unbroken. I whispered aloud almost to myself. I'm still here even if they pretend I'm not. The candle flickered as if it had heard me. At sunrise, I went through the motions of routine. I checked the mailbox, not expecting anything but flyers and coupons. And that's exactly what I found until my hand brushed a white envelope tucked between a real estate flyer and a glossy booklet promising half-off pizza. No return address. Just my name, Avis Dwyer, written in the same trembling, disciplined hand I had seen once before near the bench. I opened it right there in the driveway, wind tugging at the flap. Inside a single line, I will come not to celebrate but to repay a debt. The words felt heavier than paper should. By the time I walked into the bakery for the final tasting, the envelope was still resting in the glove box. I couldn't throw it away. Couldn't even tuck it into a drawer. It felt alive somehow, like it needed air, like the story wasn't finished yet. Inside the bakery, Kaylin was waiting, clipboard in hand, her voice moving through decisions on autopilot. I nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, and sampled a lemon raspberry layer cake that tasted like everything the wedding itself wasn't light, real bright. Sugar pearls or gold leaf, she asked. I told her to go with her gut. My gut didn't matter anymore. That night, I sat at my kitchen table dinner, untouched, the envelope spread open in front of me. The handwriting wasn't decorative. It wasn't sentimental. It was disciplined, sharp. Each line deliberate, each letter carved with purpose like a soldier's handwriting. I read the sentence again under the dim kitchen light. I will come not to celebrate, but to repay a debt. Something inside me tightened. Could it really be him? I hadn't told anyone about the man on the bench. Not my mother, not Alton, not even my sister. Especially not her. She would have laughed, called it another one of your bleeding heart projects. That's what she said last time when I suggested donating a portion of the floral budget to the food pantry. Still, I knew. Somehow I knew. The morning of the wedding arrived not with fanfare, but slowly, like the roll of a wave you can feel in your chest before it ever breaks. I sat by the window and watched the sky shift black to navy to pale blue, each shade pulling me closer to something I couldn't quite name. I dressed in silence. Hair pinned, makeup brushed on. The dress smoothed down my frame like armor disguised in lace. I let the stylist fuss with the hem while I stared out the stained glass windows of the bridal suite. My reflection in the colored glass looked fractured, broken into shards of blue and red light. And then I saw him. Not near the guests, not blending in. He wasn't dressed to dazzle or to disappear. His suit was dated but pressed with precision. His shoes polished, careful, intentional. He stood alone by the hedges at the far edge of the walkway, just outside the shadow of the chapel steeple. Still. Waiting. No nervous shifting, no glance at a watch. Just presence. I leaned toward the slats of the glass enough to catch his face. His eyes lifted as though he already knew I was watching. They were the same. Steel blue. Weathered. Knowing. How many times had I seen those eyes across a park bench? How many mornings had passed between us in silence exchanged only with nods and an understanding that didn't need words. But now those eyes were different. Focused. Certain. Full. I stepped back, heart hammering in my chest. Not from fear, but from something stranger. Something like clarity. I didn't need to ask if it was him. I knew. It was the kind of knowing that doesn't come from logic or sight, but from something deeper. Something that hums in your bones before your mind can catch up. My feet almost betrayed me. They shifted toward the door, toward him, toward that quiet steadiness that had once been nothing more than a park bench and a shared silence. I nearly crossed the room, nearly slipped through the side entrance, and let the world fall away. But then her voice came. Not out loud, not even near me, yet it was there, as if the walls themselves carried it. Avis, let's not do this now. Focus. We're on a schedule. That was always her way. Not present, not visible, but everywhere. Like a perfume you never wanted clinging to your skin no matter how much you scrubbed. And then Kaylin's voice followed, softer but just as binding. The peacekeeper. The one who smoothed over the sharp edges without ever dulling their sting. Avis, we're lining up for photos. Don't worry, everything's under control. I nodded. Of course I nodded. That's what I do. Nod. Agree. Bend myself into something manageable. Back inside, the ritual continued. The veil pinned into place. The bouquet carefully pressed into my hands. The mirror waiting tall and unblinking, reflecting not just my face, but all the ways I'd been molded. For a moment, everyone disappeared. No chatter. No instructions. Just me sitting there, the silence pressing in like water filling a glass. They didn't see what I carried. They didn't notice the small fold of paper tucked into the palm of my glove, pressed against my skin like a heartbeat. The note? Not to celebrate, but to repay a debt. I'd read it 100 times, but still the words trembled in me. What debt I had never asked him for anything. I'd never demanded his story, never needed one. All I'd done was see him. Feed him once. Share a corner of stillness in a world that prefers noise. And maybe that was the point. In a room full of people who only knew how to love me in ways that kept them comfortable, he had given me something purer. A single line that made me feel seen. That was the first gift. He saw me not as a bride, not as someone's sister, not as a placeholder in someone else's vision, but as Avis, just a woman with a sandwich, a napkin, and a little time to give. And now he had come back. Not for photos, not for cake, not for appearances. He came because once I had fed a man without asking who he was. And that somehow was enough to bind him to this day. I sat straighter, fingers curling slightly tighter around the hidden note. It steadied me more than the lace sewn into my dress, more than any flower arrangement stamped with approval. In the quiet, I whispered to my reflection, my voice trembling, but certain you don't need to be announced to matter. And softer still, sometimes one pair of eyes is enough. Then the noise returned. Laughter broke outside the door, sharp and jagged. Familiar. The kind of laughter that isn't about joy, but about cutting something down. You think she brought that homeless guy to her wedding? That's brave. The words were followed by another voice, and then her laughter. Hers first and loudest. That laughter didn't echo. It didn't ring or bounce. It fell flat heavy, like a stone dropped into mud. It landed in me with the same weight sinking deep where no one else could see. I didn't move. My hands stayed folded neatly in my lap, pressing against each other as though they were the only thing holding me together. 10 minutes later, I slipped outside onto the patio. I didn't even remember walking there. The night air was warmer than it had been all week, but it didn't soothe, didn't touch the heat that pressed behind my ribs. Music floated through the open doors. Light jazzy, a playlist chosen to keep everything easy. Easy to digest, easy to ignore. Easy to forget. I leaned against the railing, staring out at the parking lot. I wasn't searching for him. I wasn't searching for anything. I just needed a moment without their eyes, their opinions, their laughter slicing me into parts I didn't recognize. Inside, the party rolled on. Voices rose, glasses clinked. Someone called me a charity mascot come to life. I'd heard it slipping through the crowd, the words squeezed between forced compliments and the sound of wine pouring into crystal. She hadn't even hesitated before laughing. That's not inaccurate. She said her tone so casual, so dismissive, it might as well have been a shrug tossed in my direction. And something in me stilled. Not shattered, not broken, not even wounded. It simply stopped asking. Stopped begging to be understood. Because being overlooked is one thing. I've carried that weight for years, the quiet ache of fading into the background of speaking softly so others could shine louder. But being mocked for trying, being belittled for reaching out, for doing something right, for daring to believe kindness mattered, that cut differently. It didn't sting like a fresh wound. It hardened like stone forming under pressure. I turned toward the glass door, eyes drawn back inside. Vela stood at the center of it, all orbiting in her own spotlight. Her laughter ringing clear, her hands mid-gesture, as though she were starring in a photo shoot for some lifestyle magazine that glorified polished perfection. She was glossy, curated an advertisement for herself. And me, I was the contrast, the cautionary tale they whispered about when they thought I wasn't listening. This was never about a wedding, I murmured to no one but myself. It was about the spotlight. About who gets to own it. A memory rose uninvited. A lunch years ago, back when Dad was still alive. We had nothing fancy on the table, just deli sandwiches on paper plates, mustard smudged on napkins, the kind of meal that never makes it into anyone's scrapbook. Dad, faithful as ever, had bowed his head to say grace. He always did, whether it was steak or cold cuts. He hadn't gotten past bless this food when Vela's phone buzzed. She lifted her hand like a queen, granting herself permission to interrupt. She had a call she couldn't miss, some deal about metrics and conversions, and without hesitation she answered. No one stopped her. Not even Mom. Dad just went quiet, fork resting in his hand, the prayer unfinished. His voice swallowed, erased, drowned beneath the clamor of her ambition. They never heard him either, I whispered, and the truth of it tightened in my chest. When I finally stepped back inside, the air pressed heavy against me. Not just warm, not just crowded, dense. A performance in every breath. I didn't stop at the bar, didn't pause to fake a smile or exchange pleasantries. I walked straight through past clinking glasses and polite laughter until I reached the flower arch where Vela and Mom stood together. Mom turned first, smiling like everything was fine, as though 10 minutes ago her daughter hadn't been ripped apart as a joke. Her smile said, "Behave, pretend, don't ruin this." Vela turned too. Her face unreadable, but her eyes betrayed something fleeting. Maybe guilt, maybe calculation. I didn't care enough to wait and see which mask she'd choose. I locked eyes with Mom. My voice was steady, quiet, stripped of decoration. After tonight, I said I won't let her speak for me again. Mom blinked. Just once. No words came. Vela scoffed under her breath, too sharp to be hidden. "Avis, don't be dramatic. It was just a joke." "No," I said softly. "It wasn't." And I didn't explain. I didn't try to justify. I simply turned, letting the rhythm of my heels against the floor be the only punctuation to the moment. Each step felt like something I hadn't owned in years' certainty. In the back hallway near the dressing rooms, Kaylin appeared. Frazzled but fighting for composure, her headset crooked, her clipboard cluttered with notes she probably wouldn't have time to organize. She caught sight of me, lowered her voice. "Avis," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "There's a man outside. Asked for you specifically." My chest tightened. "Who? He didn't give a name," she said. "Just told me you'd know him. By his shoes." My heart didn't race. It slowed, settling into something deeper than panic, deeper than fear. Clarity, because I did know. I'd always known. Every morning at the bench, even when his clothes spoke of forgotten winters and sleepless nights, his shoes had shined. Polished. Intentional. A ritual of dignity in a world that offered him none. I nodded once, firm. "Tell him I'll be right there." Kaylin hesitated, her hand tightening on the clipboard. Vela said I stepped past her before she could finish. Vela says a lot of things, I cut in my voice, even certain. And this time, I'm not asking for permission. I moved down the corridor, the stone floor cool beneath my heels. Each step was quiet, but in my bones it rang like a drum. declaration, defiance. I am not invisible. A side door waited tucked behind the altar. The brass handle glinted in the dim light, and I could already feel the shift in the air seeping through its edges. Different air. Untamed. Honest. And for the first time that night, I felt like I was walking toward something real. Less perfume, less noise, less of the manufactured sweetness that clung to every corner of the venue, just the weight of calm that pressed against my chest, heavy and certain, the way air feels right before a storm breaks. She stood near the floral arch, framed like a painting she'd staged for herself. Arms crossed, phone in hand, fingers curled around it like it was a remote that could pause the world at her command. When her eyes found me, she didn't smile, didn't soften. She just tilted her chin, efficient, impatient. We start photos in 20. She said, not asking why I was there, not caring if I had reason. I stopped a few feet short of her, steady enough to hold her gaze without flinching. If he shows up, I said, my voice quiet, but certain, don't turn him away. Her expression didn't crack right away. She blinked once, twice, then let out a clipped laugh that landed like glass against tile. Avis, she said, lowering her phone with deliberate slowness. This isn't a soup kitchen. It's a wedding. A real one. I know exactly what it is. She stepped closer, then her perfume dragging behind her like a banner, her tone dropping just above a whisper. If he tries to walk in here like a guest dressed like that, don't worry. I'll take care of it. You don't need the stress. I felt my breath sharpen, but I didn't falter. I don't need you protecting me from the only man who's shown me more respect in silence than this family has in 10 years. Something flickered in her smirk. Brief, almost invisible, but she caught it before it slipped too far. She reset her mask, smug and polished. You always did love your little projects, she said, voice dripping with the same condescension she used when she once caught me carrying groceries to a neighbor's doorstep. I stepped forward close enough that she had to either hear me or retreat. Don't mistake kindness for fragility. I told her each word deliberate, heavy. You've spent your life curating events. I've spent mine watching what people do when no one's looking. She didn't answer. She turned, shoulders stiff, walking away toward the main aisle like the conversation hadn't happened. Like she could erase it the way she erased everything that didn't serve her script. I didn't call after her. A few moments later, Kaylin appeared. Headset askew, clipboard clutched too tightly, trying her best to be the buffer between chaos and calm. She smoothed her jacket, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The cupcakes just got delivered, she said softly, like she was offering me an anchor. They're setting them up in the back. Do you want to take a look before the guests come in? I nodded, not because I cared about cupcakes, but because nodding had become my default survival. The kitchen smelled of vanilla sugar and nerves. Staff moved quickly, aligning trays of white frosted cupcakes on a tiered display with the precision of surgeons. It should have felt comforting ordinary, but instead it felt clinical. Another layer of performance sweetness arranged for show. A boy barely out of high school, sleeves rolled up, cheeks flushed with effort, walked past me with a tray. He paused, mid-step, recognition flickering in his eyes. Hey, he said almost casually. Aren't you the lady who used to bring food to that guy at the bench? You know, near the bus stop? I froze. Yes, I said careful. Why? He shrugged, setting the tray down. I think I saw him a few weeks ago. Thought he was dead. I mean, people were saying that. His words weren't cruel. They were careless, tossed into the air like scraps, not realizing they'd land in me like stones. I said nothing. My throat closed around every possible reply. Instead, I stared at the rows of white icing. My hands suddenly cold, my stomach tightening against the truth I hadn't wanted to face. That man, Elias. I hadn't heard his name until recently, but I had known him for years without needing one. A name wasn't what tethered us. It was nods, sandwiches, silence that didn't diminish. When he disappeared for months, I let myself wonder but never pressed too hard. Because if the answer was what I feared it might break something in me, I wasn't sure I could repair. And now he was here, and she wanted to pretend he wasn't. I slipped out quietly, leaving the smell of sugar behind, taking the side stairs up to the balcony where no one followed. The sanctuary stretched beneath me, dressed in perfection, rows of chairs lined like soldiers' flowers, staged for photographs, lighting programmed to flatter angles and faces. It all gleamed expensive. It all gleamed false. I leaned against the railing, the wood cool beneath my hands, and let my eyes fall shut. Vela thinks people like him don't belong here. I whispered into the cavernous quiet. Maybe she was right. My voice shook once, but steadied. Maybe I don't belong either. Not in a wedding where the guest list was curated like a social media feed where every flower arrangement was chosen to impress strangers more than honor truth. Not in a room where beauty was staged and belonging was conditional. But I knew who I was. I knew the woman who, rain or shine, fed a man when he was invisible to everyone else. I knew the girl who never asked for applause, never demanded a seat at the table, but kept showing up anyway. And I knew clearer than ever that I would not let her write me out of this chapter. Not anymore. A voice rose up from below, rushed slightly breathless, tugging me out of my thoughts. Miss Dwyer. I turned. An usher was climbing the steps 2 at a time. His cheeks flushed from the effort, his hands gripping the banister. There's a man outside asking for you, he said, trying to catch his breath. He's not on the guest list, but he says you'll know him. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. Did he say anything else? The usher nodded quickly. Yeah, said you'd know him by his shoes. That was all I needed. My heart clenched, not in fear, but in recognition. I followed the usher down the corridor, past towers of flowers that smelled of money, not love, and polished tile that gleamed under chandeliers like a stage set. Everything expensive, everything curated, everything false. At the end of the hall, the double doors to the front courtyard were cracked open. I stopped just short of them. Through the glass, I saw him. He stood with his hands loosely clasped in front of him, posture steady, waiting without demand. His gray suit wasn't new, it carried years in its seams, but it had been pressed with care the way someone tends to something that still matters. And his shoes. God, those shoes. Polished not to shine for others, but to keep memory intact. They caught the light like a quiet signal. He wasn't scanning for attention, wasn't angling for entry. He was just there, present, waiting. Before I could move toward him, one of the security staff stepped into view. Broad shoulders, earpiece curled tight, walkie clipped to his belt. The kind of man paid not to ask questions, only to enforce. He leaned in toward Elias, said something I couldn't hear, but I saw the pause it created. Elias nodded once. No protest, no argument, no scene. Just calm acceptance like he had been told not here 1,000 times before. And then he turned slow, deliberate, and began stepping back toward the sidewalk. My hand went for the door handle, desperate, but it was too late. He'd already been dismissed. From behind me, a voice drifted in light, flat, sharp enough to cut. Some people just don't belong in certain spaces. She was standing a few feet away, adjusting one of her earrings in the mirrored wall as if nothing unusual had happened. As if exiling a man cost no more thought than rearranging a piece of jewelry. Her words landed harder than she knew, or maybe exactly as hard as she intended. I looked at her, really looked, and saw her for what she was. Not nervous, not hesitant. Composed, focused, running her show. And to her, I wasn't the bride, wasn't the sister, wasn't even family. I was the liability. Too soft, too unpredictable, too me. I didn't answer her. My silence was heavier than words. I just turned and walked away. Inside, the noise was rising, the music swelling, the buzz of voices layering into a low, elegant hum. Guests arriving in pressed clothes, exchanging compliments that sounded rehearsed. Perfume mixed with wine, laughter with glassware. The theater of belonging unfolding. I slipped back into the bridal room where the final touches were being staged like props before a performance. Makeup artists brushing color onto already flushed cheeks, photographers crouching to capture shoes and rings, bridesmaids half posing, half fussing with their hair. Then it came. A voice from the corner light amused, "Is that the guy from the bus stop?" Another chimed in, mock curious. Brave of her to bring her projects to the altar. And then came the voice I knew would follow, smooth as ever, never missing her cue. Avis always believed in rescue stories, she said, even if no one asked her to. Laughter followed, not loud but sharp, enough to pierce. Enough to remind me of my role, the soft one, the foolish one, the girl who didn't know where she belonged. I didn't say a word. I didn't move. I just sat in the chair still as stone staring into the mirror. The veil draped across my hair, the earrings glinting in the light, the lipstick painted on my lips, but none of it looked like me. It looked like a mannequin they'd dressed for display. Without a word, I reached up. My fingers slid to the earrings. One, then the other. I placed them on the vanity, the small sound of metal against glass louder than the laughter outside. And for the first time that day, my hands didn't shake. Somewhere outside that room, Elias had already turned away, dismissed by someone who thought worth could be measured by invitation lists and dress codes. Someone who believed he wasn't worthy of walking through the door. But I knew better. I rose from the chair without hesitation. Kaylin's voice called after me from across the room, tight and sharp with urgency. Avis, we're starting the processional in 5. I didn't answer. I didn't even turn my head. Her words dissolved behind me like background noise I no longer owed my attention. I slipped through the side door down the short corridor lined with forgotten storage crates and dim lights and pushed out into the early evening air. The courtyard was cool, the sky painted in dusky shades of lavender and gold. Guests hadn't noticed yet. The musicians were still tuning their instrument strings, humming, and clarinets sighing with half-finished notes. Across the courtyard, Alton spotted me. Confusion spread over his face. He began to step toward me, hand half raised as if to ask what I was doing, but I kept going. My steps were steady, deliberate, almost ceremonial. And then I saw him. Elias sat on a bench tucked near the edge of the courtyard, one of those benches people walk past without a glance, a piece of scenery no one notices. But I saw it. I saw him. His posture was calm, not demanding, not pleading. Just there. Waiting. When he sensed me near, he lifted his head. His eyes caught mine, but he didn't speak. I lowered myself to the ground beside him, smoothing the edge of my dress out of habit. Not vanity, an act that felt like grounding myself in the moment. My voice was quiet, almost fragile. I'm sorry they treated you like that. His lips curved into the faintest smile, soft and steady. I didn't come for cake. I nodded, breath catching in my throat. No. You came because someone saw you when no one else would. For a heartbeat, silence settled between us, heavier than words. He met my eyes, steady, unwavering. That matters more than you think. Something inside me shifted then. I stood, reaching down, offering my arm. Then walk with me, not for them. For us. He hesitated just long enough for my heart to ache, and then he rose his hand, taking mine, his arm steadying against mine. The weight of that choice was quiet but thunderous. We moved together, step by step, across the courtyard and up the wide church steps. The heavy wooden doors parted and the noise inside softened like a collective breath drawn in disbelief. I didn't glance at anyone. I didn't need to. Gasps rippled like wind through a field. A few phones lifted uncertain, then lowered again, as if even technology couldn't decide if this moment was sacred or scandalous. But I kept walking. Elias at my side. My chin high. My silence louder than anything they'd rehearsed. There was no music, no cue, no officiant calling us forward. Only presence. And sometimes presence speaks louder than any script. From the back, a whisper. Who is he? But before the question could settle, another sound rose, distant at first, then undeniable. Footsteps, steady, rhythmic, synchronized, boots striking stone with perfect unity. The sound grew louder, echoing across the front courtyard, spilling through the open doors like a drumbeat wrapped in warning. Guests turned their heads. Conversations froze mid-sentence. A woman near the aisle clutched her glass so tightly her knuckles went white. Another dropped hers altogether, the shatter on marble sharp and final like flint striking steel. And then they appeared. 20 men in full dress blues, Marines. 10 on each side. The formation was flawless, precise, unwavering. Shoulders squared, gloves, white shoes gleaming. Their faces were carved from resolve, their bodies aligned into a living wall of honor. They didn't need music. They didn't need an introduction. They didn't need permission. The crowd parted instinctively like the sea before a tide no one could control. Evena, who had been standing stiffly at the front beside the planner, took one startled step back. Her voice, usually wrapped in composure and calculation, cracked as she whispered, "This wasn't in the program." Alton reached for my hand instinct, tugging him forward, but I had already stepped ahead. Already chosen. Already aligned. The Marines halted in unison, boots landing with the precision of thunder made flesh stopping just a few feet in front of us. The silence that followed was so complete, so reverent, it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. In the center of their line stood the one who carried himself with unmistakable authority. He was taller than the rest, shoulders squared beneath the weight of years, his chest broad with service bars that caught the light like quiet metals of fire. His nameplate read, Duncan. He didn't scan the room, didn't acknowledge the crowd. He looked directly at me. And then with emotion so practiced it felt eternal, he lifted his hand in salute. "Ma'am?" He said, voice even steady but carrying through every inch of the chapel. "We come today to honor the woman who sustained a fellow Marine for 6 years. Without her, he would not be alive." The words did not fall. They landed. A ripple moved through the guests like wind rolling through tall grass, restless, unsure. I heard the sharp edges of whispers cut the silence. Wait, what is he serious? Who is she talking about? And then nothing. A silence so heavy it pressed down on the room, forcing every breath slower, heavier. Elias had remained still through it all. Quiet. But now he straightened. His frame lengthened, his shoulders set. Taller than I had ever seen him. He didn't need to speak. His body spoke for him. His silence told the truth louder than words could ever bear. From somewhere in the back, a hushed voice, was he military? Another voice, brittle, incredulous. This can't be real. But her attempt to wrest control back, the same woman who always claimed the room collapsed midway. Her words cracked, fell apart, dissolved in the air. For once, no one turned to her for permission to feel. For once, she wasn't the center. Captain Duncan turned, slightly motioning to one of the Marines on his right. A young man stepped forward, posture sharp, holding a black velvet frame against his chest. He moved with reverence as though carrying something more fragile than glass. Inside the frame was a commendation letter, laminated, bordered with brass edges. And beside it, a single photo. Elias, in full combat gear. Dirt streaking his face helmet, slightly askew, his arms straining as he carried another wounded Marine across his shoulders. The caption below read Fallujah 2004. Gasps broke the silence, sharp but stifled as if no one dared let them echo. This was never claimed, Duncan said, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. He stepped forward, holding the frame out with both hands. He declined all commendations after his discharge. But he credits you with giving him the will to live long enough to finally accept it. The weight of the moment sank into my chest as I reached forward, taking the frame with both hands. My fingers curled around its edges. They did not shake. I didn't know who he was. I said, my voice clear, unwavering, as if it had been waiting years for this sentence. I only knew he mattered. The words hung there. And for the first time, people believed me. A few guests lowered their heads in shame. A woman in the third row quietly pressed a handkerchief to her cheek. Behind us, the Marines stood in perfect stillness, 20 statues carved from loyalty shoulders, squared gloves bright against the dim light of the chapel. No one moved. No one dared. I turned my head just slightly to Elias. His expression remained composed, but his eyes had softened. Not in weakness, not in defeat, softened in the way peace does, like a weight finally set down after being carried too long. He hadn't come to disrupt. He hadn't come to steal a moment. He had come to finish a story the rest of them never even knew had begun. And for the first time in that chapel, I wasn't the girl they tolerated politely, the fragile one, the sentimental one, the backdrop. For the first time, I was the one they had to see. Captain Duncan gave me a final nod of respect, then stepped back into formation. And then it happened. 20 Marines' boots planted firm gloves resting at their sides lifted their arms in unison. Their salutes rose as one body, one motion, one thunderous silence. This time no one laughed. No one corrected them. No one dared to interrupt. Alton reached for my hand again, and this time I let him. I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. There was no spectacle, no theatrics, no headline moment. Only stillness. A stillness that was not empty but full. The kind of stillness that carries power. The kind of truth that doesn't need to shout to be heard. This moment was not about grandeur. It was about being seen fully, finally, exactly as I had always been. At the front, she turned her heels sharp against the stone floor. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She just looked back once, eyes wide face, unreadable. And then she walked out the hush in the chapel, holding like a breath long overdue. The silence she left behind did not feel awkward. It felt earned. Captain Duncan remained standing, Elias at his side. Then Duncan reached beneath his arm, pulling out a dark blue folder. The gold emblem embossed on the cover caught the light gleaming like fire in his grip. With the precision of ritual, he opened it. The room leaned forward without meaning to every eye drawn, every breath tethered to what would be revealed next. No ceremony, no fanfare, only intention. Captain Duncan opened the folder with the kind of precision that made the air tighten, and then began to read. His voice was low, steady, but carried the weight of years, the kind of voice that didn't need amplification to be heard. Sergeant Elias Harlow, Fallujah, Iraq, 2004. Decorated for bravery under direct fire. Credited with saving 9 fellow Marines during a surprise ambush. Sustained injuries both seen and unseen. Lost his family in a vehicle accident in 2016. Refused all military benefits. Disappeared. The words fell like stones into water, rippling through the chapel until no one could ignore them. Somewhere behind me, I heard a sharp intake of breath. The sound of someone realizing the story they thought they knew was smaller than the truth. A man in the third row slowly removed his glasses, pressing the fabric of his sleeve against his eyes, unashamed of the tears streaking down. Captain Duncan paused, then closing the folder halfway as though the paper was not what mattered most. He lifted his head and found my eyes. He never told anyone who he was? He said, voice quieter now, but sharper for it. Not even us. But he told you. Or maybe... He let the words hang, then finished. Maybe he didn't need to tell you. You already knew enough because you treated him like a man long before you ever knew he'd earned a salute. The silence deepened. It was no longer absence of sound, but presence of weight. Elias didn't move. But I saw it, the smallest shift in his shoulders and the line of his spine. Like someone finally setting down a rucksack after carrying it across a desert. The kind of relief that doesn't smile, doesn't weep, but breathes. I felt my own lungs expand, not because I needed to speak, but because the moment itself seemed to invite me forward. My dress brushed the edge of the riser as I stepped up, the soft sound louder in the hush than a trumpet fanfare. I turned to face them all. Not with fire, not with anger, but with something stronger clarity. For years I began voice steady, carried by the quiet more than any microphone could have. I brought him food. Not out of pity. Not to feel better about myself. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his past. I didn't need to. He looked tired. He looked human. And that was enough. Eyes fixed on me now. No scoffing, no laughter. No sideways glances this time. Even the ones who had once whispered their mockery sat still. Heads tilted, caught in the grip of something bigger than their rehearsed roles. We like to tell ourselves, I continued, that worth is something earned by titles, by promotions, by grand gestures. But sometimes... My throat tightened but didn't break. Sometimes it's earned by simply staying. By showing up day after day, even when no one sees you. Especially then. A woman in the front row nodded slowly, eyes shining. Her husband's hand came to rest on her arm, not in correction, but in quiet agreement. I turned my gaze briefly toward the Marines. One of them, a tall man, dark-skinned, posture immaculate, lowered his head slightly a bow, so subtle it might have been missed, but to me it was confirmation. Silent, dignified agreement that what I said was not just sentiment. It was truth. When I finished, I didn't retreat. I didn't slip back into the shadows or into my seat like an afterthought. I stayed at the front beside Elias, not as a performance, but as a truth. My truth. The ceremony did not resume in the way anyone expected. There was no grand announcement, no forced segue. Instead, the room shifted, softened. Guests began to rise slowly, almost reverently. Some walked toward the Marines, shaking hands in hushed gratitude. Others leaned to one another, whispering, not gossip this time, but questions. Questions heavy with regret. How didn't we know? How long had he been out there? How could we have missed it? And then my mother. She approached without entourage, without her usual air of authority. She stopped just in front of me, hands folded neatly, her face softer than I had seen it in years. For once, there was no script in her eyes, no calculation. She didn't rush to fill the air. She just stood there for a moment, as though gathering the courage to let words find their own way. Finally, she said quietly, "Your father would have been proud of you today." That was all. Nothing gilded, nothing embellished, and somehow it was enough. Her hand brushed mine briefly before she turned and walked down the aisle, her figure retreating into the dissolving crowd. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was begging her to see me. She just did. The chapel was thinning, voices fading, but I remained. Elias stood steady beside me, and together we gathered the framed commendation, its glass cool beneath my fingertips. The late afternoon light had shifted by then, streaming through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in fractured colors, blue, gold, crimson. It felt less like an ending than a benediction. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the stained glass, splintering across the chapel floor like a mosaic of memories, blue, amber, crimson patchwork light that shifted with every breath of dust in the air. The last guests trickled out in quiet pairs, their footsteps soft against the stone, unwilling to disturb what still lingered here. Outside, I could hear the faint shuffle of the string quartet packing up the case latches, snapping shut one by one. The echoes faded, leaving behind a silence that didn't feel empty but reverent. Elias reached into his jacket pocket. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, as though the object inside had weight far beyond its size. When he drew it out, I knew immediately. A folded napkin, edges worn, creased from age. The ink had bled just slightly into the fibers, the way old words do when time insists on pressing its thumb into them. My handwriting. I recognized it before my mind had even caught up. Hope today is kind. The same words I had scrawled on scraps of napkin and paper mornings, without count left on his bench, without expectation of reply. They had been my small offering to a stranger I thought might never notice. Yet here it was, kept all these years, proof that he had. But beneath my line in a different hand were 5 words, simple, almost shy in their honesty. You were my kind day. My breath caught. I stared at the words until they blurred, and for the first time since I was a child, I let tears rise without fighting them back. Not tears of sorrow, not even of relief. Tears of being seen fully, without condition, without disguise. When the last guest finally left and the chapel doors clicked shut with a sound that felt more like sealing than closing, the spell broke. The world tilted back toward ordinary. Hours later, I found myself in our kitchen at home. Barefoot hem of my dress, still brushing the cool tile hair, undone mascara, smudged but uncared for. The fridge hummed quietly, a low mechanical heartbeat. Alton poured 2 glasses of water, slid one across the counter toward me. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was not absence, but presence, the exact language I needed just then. Between us on the table sat the napkin. That fragile square of paper, edges curled, carried more history than I had realized. On the front, my years-old words beside Elias's 5. A conversation written across time between strangers who had once saved each other without knowing it. Curiosity tugged me, and I turned the napkin over. On the back in smaller script, tight careful, as though he had whispered the words onto the fibers, I found 2 more lines. You reminded me I was still human. Your father did that too. I read them once. Then again, slower. The second time the tears didn't come. Instead, a smile quiet, restrained one that lived not on my lips but behind my eyes. The kind of smile that acknowledges both grief and grace in the same breath. Alton reached over fingers warm as they closed around mine. No grand speeches, no reassurances. Just his hand covering mine, steadying me in a way that words could not. We sat there for a long while. No music, no ceremony, just the hush of evening settling over the house. Breathing. Existing. Letting stillness be the loudest part of the day. The weeks that followed unfolded gently without spectacle. She never called, I hadn't expected her to. Sometimes Mom did, but our conversations were light skimming across the surface of weather reports and new soup recipes she found in glossy magazines. She never mentioned the wedding, and I didn't press. For once, silence between us wasn't a wound. It was space. Alton and I never took the honeymoon we had postponed. Instead, we made a different kind of plan. There's a park downtown, not the kind that makes postcards, but the kind that lingers in the memory of the people who pass through it. Cracked sidewalks, a playground with peeling paint, a concrete picnic table that had seen better decades. But in the far corner where eucalyptus trees leaned like quiet sentinels was a patch of stillness untouched by noise. That's where we chose to invest what others might have spent on flights and hotel rooms. Not in a trip that would fade into photographs, but in something that could root itself here. A simple wooden bench, a table. Nothing polished, nothing engraved. Just a shaded place for anyone who might stumble upon it. We called it the quiet table. No plaques, no names, no social media posts declaring ownership. Just a surface to set down a meal, a place to rest. Some mornings we left a thermos of coffee there, steam curling into the dawn with a note card taped to the lid. The words were always simple. No ID required. Just come hungry. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was recognition, the same kind I had once written on napkins to a stranger on a bench. Now it belonged to anyone who needed a kind day. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. 2 or 3 people in the early hours, sometimes only one. On certain mornings, no one came at all. Yet by sunset, the sandwich and thermos were always gone. Never wasted. Never forgotten. Word spread the way gentle things do, not like fire racing across fields, but like roots beneath the soil, moving slow, unseen, and wide. Almost a year to the day since our wedding, I returned to the park just as the sun stretched its first warmth across the damp grass. Dew shimmered like 1,000 small mirrors, and the eucalyptus leaves whispered in the breeze. I expected the stillness. Instead, I found them waiting. All 20. Not in uniform this time, there were no medals, no polished boots. Jeans hoodies, flannel shirts. A baseball cap pulled low over tired eyes. A tattoo sleeve winding down a forearm like a map of places only he knew. Yet the formation was the same disciplined, deliberate align that spoke not of ceremony, but of remembrance. Each man held a single flower. One by one, they stepped forward, placed their bloom along the edge of the table, and stepped back again. No words, no instruction, just the rhythm of men who had once survived together and still carried the instinct of moving as one. When the last flower rested on the wood, the tallest of them met my gaze. His voice was quiet but steady, carrying weight I felt in my chest. We take shifts here now. Your kindness fed more than one man. I didn't answer. My throat wouldn't allow it. Instead, I stood with them in silence until the final petal lay on the table, the color soft against the weathered grain. She never came. Not that day, not any day after. No card, no text, no acknowledgement. Once her silence had been a wall I bruised myself against, desperate for recognition. Now it was nothing more than background noise like the hum of the fridge or the ticking of a distant clock. Always there, no longer sharp. Weeks later, a package arrived. No return address. Inside, wrapped in crinkled tissue paper, was a photograph I had never seen. Me, no more than 4, perched on Dad's lap at a park bench. His uniform pressed his arms loose but protective around me, his smile effortless in a way I hadn't remembered. There was no note, no explanation, just the image. I didn't call her. I didn't need to. Instead, I placed the photo in a simple frame and slid it onto the shelf above our coffee mugs. Not as a shrine, not as a declaration, just as something that belonged there. Quiet, waiting, present. That evening, I walked to the park alone. The table stood where we had left it, wood a shade darker from rain edges softened by wind. The small plaque still glimmered faintly. Feeding one person feeds a life. I placed down a sandwich and coffee, no ceremony, no audience. The eucalyptus shifted above me. The silence stretched long enough that I felt the world slow around me like time itself had chosen to sit beside me for a moment. When I finally rose and began to walk away, I glanced back over my shoulder. A figure approached from the far sidewalk, hands tucked deep into the pockets of a worn jacket. He didn't look at me, didn't nod or smile. Just lowered himself onto the bench, lifted the cup, and drank. No camera flash, no applause, no headline. But the table had done what it was built to do. Sometimes justice doesn't thunder through courtrooms or roar with applause. Sometimes it arrives as quietly as a sandwich left waiting a shaded place to sit the dignity of not needing to explain who you are or why you're there. Sometimes the victories that matter most are the ones no one else sees. The ones that slip quietly into your memory and settle there, waiting to remind you later what it means to be human. And before this story fades into the back of your mind, I want to leave you with this. I never set out to change a life. I wasn't chasing gratitude or recognition. I wasn't trying to be a savior. I simply chose to see someone the world had stopped seeing. And I refused to look away. That choice, small, almost invisible at the time, was the one that mattered most. In a world that demands we be louder, shinier, more polished, more powerful, just to be noticed. Sometimes the real difference comes from the quiet, the steady, the consistent acts of human decency. From showing up when no one else does and choosing to keep seeing someone everyone else has stopped seeing. Maybe you've stood where I stood, overlooked, underestimated, told to stay silent while someone else tried to rewrite your story. Or maybe, like so many of us, you've walked past someone like Elias and wondered about their story but kept going, afraid of what you might find if you stopped. So let me ask you now, have you ever truly been seen? Not for what you earned, not for what you owned, not for the titles or the image you presented to the world, but simply for who you are at your quietest, most unpolished self. And maybe even more importantly, when was the last time you made someone else feel seen? I want to hear from you. Share your story with me. If this one reached something in you, drop a 1 in the comments or just tell me where you're watching from. And if it didn't, I still want to know why your perspective matters. Your voice matters. And if stories like this speak to you, real stories, quiet heroes, loud truths, then hit that subscribe button. Stick around. Because the people who change the world aren't always the ones standing in the spotlight. Sometimes they're the ones no one even saw coming. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.